Hi, I'm Professor McCoy, and today we're going to talk about various uncharitable arguments. So this relates to a certain category of logical fallacies, primarily informal fallacies. So I'm going to link below the previous lecture on informal fallacies more generally, where I go through a few at a time and explain what makes these fallacious arguments bad arguments. This time, though, I want to focus on a particular category of fallacious arguments, which are especially uncharitable. So this comes back to a topic I mentioned in that previous video, which is the principle of charity, which says that we should always try to interpret our opponent or interlocutor in a way that's plausible, that's believable, in the best possible light. So, in other words, we shouldn't assume that they don't know what they're talking about or assume that their arguments are wrong. We should always assume that they do know what they're talking about and that there's some merit to their argument, and try and find the way of interpreting them that makes the most possible sense. So on the converse of that, to be uncharitable in one's argument is to do the opposite. It's to assume that one's opponent or one's interlocutor is incorrect. It's to interpret their argument in a way, that is more obviously wrong, right? So we're taking a weaker version of their argument. We're looking at their argument as, for their way of looking at this might maybe looking at their argument as something to be defeated rather than something that might be correct. Right? So you're looking for flaws rather than looking for good arguments. So some of these, I'm going to go through several of them. The most obvious of them are the various kinds of strawman argument. This is something that I went over in the previous video as well, but I want to go into the different kinds and how exactly this works. So a strawman argument is the idea of you're setting up a fake version of your opponent's argument. Right? You're mischaracterizing their argument in a way that you can defeat it more easily. And this is just for the purpose of showing that your arguments are correct by setting up a weak opponent for them. Or just showing up, or maybe showing off your skill as a debater or as a rhetorician. This comes from the idea of you setting up, rather than fighting your actual opponent, you're setting up this straw dummy and punching that over to demonstrate, look how hard I can punch, or that sort of thing. Right? So the idea of from boxing. It's clear that this is probably the clearest example of an uncharitable argument, because you're not even taking your opponent's argument seriously enough to present it. Rather, you're presenting your own caricatured version of their argument that you know that you can knock down. Now, there's a slightly more charitable but still fallacious version of the straw man argument called the weak man argument, which, rather than making up your own version of your opponent's argument, you take a similar argument to what your opponent is making that is really put forward by somebody. Although that's usually put forward by somebody who lacks the expertise that you would want to be arguing for or against. Right? So they lack the expertise you'd want to be discussing with. So in other words, you're taking the weakest version of your opponent's argument that you can find, but you can actually find. Right? So this can either be digging through what your opponent has said, and again, I'll note here as well, I keep saying opponent here, primarily because that's the attitude of an uncharitable debater or arguer. Interlocutor is probably a more appropriate way of considering the person you're having an argumentative dialogue with. But again, for the sake of this, I will probably refer back to an opponent, although I may use either one. Right. So what you may do, back to the topic at hand, to the weak man argument, to make one of these, what you might do is you might search through everything that your opponent has said, whether that's in print, whether that's in what they've previously said verbally, or even what they've said earlier in a debate. And you can take a weak version of the argument that they're presenting and attack that, rather than taking either what they're saying now and arguing against that, or taking the strongest version of their argument that you can find that they've presented and arguing against that. What you might also do is you might find an argument by somebody who supports roughly the same conclusion that your opponent supports. But find usually someone who's not an expert, or if they are an expert, someone who's made a particularly weak argument, and attack that and disprove that, arguing against somebody else's weaker argument, rather than what your opponent is saying. So, for example, you might see, examples I used in the previous lecture are, so you might have suppose you have an evolutionary biologist and a theologian who are arguing against one another about the existence of God. The theologian argues against the evolutionary biologist, something that maybe a science popularizer says, that the universe simply popped into existence without a cause, and that it was entirely random, or that gravity caused the universe to exist, which winds up being tightly circular. It's a circular argument because gravity is part of what we're trying to explain, right? And the theologian might point out that that's a bad argument, right? Rightly point out that that's a bad argument. But it's not what his argumentative opponent is putting forward, right? So on the other hand, you might have the evolutionary biologist who is arguing against the theologian, saying, Christians claim that claim that the world is only 6,000 years old, and that God created man from dust, and that the evolutionary process had no part in this, right? Of course, that has nothing to do with what the theologians actually claimed in the argument. What each of them have done in this case is found someone who holds their opponent's view, but holds it at a weaker, in a weaker way, or with weaker arguments, or at a naive level, or doesn't fully present or doesn't fully understand the arguments at hand. And he presents that as, well, what my opponent's really saying is this weaker version. And then they attack and then they argue against that, rather than actually addressing what the other person has to say. I think this brings up, this shows us pretty well the problem with uncharitable arguments, being that they're not addressing one another, right? So if you're not arguing charitably, what you're really doing is, especially for straw man style arguments, is you're arguing against an imagined version of your opponent, rather than actually arguing against the person who you're talking to. There's another version of this, which doesn't really have a name. I usually refer to it as the Straw Frankenstein, because it involves taking pieces of arguments from different people, that either people you disagree with or people who share the broad ideology of the person you're arguing against, and stitching those arguments from different people into this Frankenstein argument, or this Frankenstein position that no one really holds. Here's a simple, lighthearted example of that.
Why do you consider a woman a tease if she doesn't sleep with you after 3 dates, but a slut if she sleeps with you on the first date?
So that isn't exactly the kind of thing that we ordinarily discuss using, complex philosophical argumentation, but it does illustrate the point, right? There isn't really any particular person, right? You couldn't actually find a person who holds the view that that a woman who decides not to sleep with to have sex after the third date is a prude, but also the woman who does have sex early in the relationship is a slut, right? You really won't find somebody who holds both of those positions together. Now, You might disagree with both of those positions, okay? And you might find different people who are, broadly speaking, within the same ideological framework who hold those positions, right? Person A holds one position, person B holds the other position, sure. And you can kind of stitch those together into a view and say, hey, look, here's a crazy view that obviously contradicts itself, or at least is in conflict with itself in some way. Well, sure, that's true, right? But the problem is that whoever you're discussing with doesn't actually hold that view, because no one holds that view in particular. What you've done is you've constructed a view from what various different people have to say and shown how it's contradictory. Well, of course it's contradictory. You've constructed it from whole cloth. Maybe a more sophisticated version of this. If we look to theology, or maybe philosophy of religion, we can say that, well, Christians hold that, on the one hand, God predestines all human actions. But on the other hand, human beings are said to have libertarian free will. And we can choose what actions we can do, and we have alternate possibilities. So it seems like there's a contradiction here, because we're saying on the one hand that God thoroughly causes all of the actions that human beings are taking, right? God predestines all of those actions, and that human beings really decide on what those actions are going to be. And there's a contradiction. However, you generally won't find a theologian who believes both of those things. Usually they believe one or the other, or a particular view in the middle, right? Or they soften one, or they hold a different view which has something to do with one or something to do with the other, or they might forthrightly deny both. It's possible, although uncommon. So if you're making this argument to say, well, clearly the view that Christianity holds with respect to free will and human choice is incoherent. Well, that's not the case, because different Christians will hold different views regarding this issue, and they conflict with one another, but putting them next to each other and trying to construct a single sort of Frankenstein view out of those different viewpoints. That's not something that you would even need to argue against, because it's not something that anyone holds. So in a sense, it's basically a straw man argument, because you're just constructing something that you can easily tear down. Okay, so excuse me. The second area of arguments that are uncharitable that I want to look into is questioning the motives of one's interlocutor or one's opponent. This relates to something I mentioned in the previous video, which has somewhat to do with ad hominem. Sorry, it has something to do with an ad hominem argument, or a specific kind. It's similar to Bulverism, which I mentioned as well. But it is it's a particular kind of thing which is specifically uncharitable in one's arguments. So this involves assuming that one's opponent is putting forward an argument for the wrong reasons. Right? That their reasons for arguing aren't simply to assert what's true, or to even just convince you of something, but because they have some ulterior motive. Right? You see this often in politics, where you might say that your political opponent is putting forward an argument because they think they'll benefit from that policy. Right? You're in favor of tax cuts because you're wealthy, or you're in favor of a certain social program because you'll benefit from it. Right? Something like that. This is uncharitable because it's not taking the opponent's argument seriously, because the argument isn't about whether I'll benefit, right? Or it isn't about why I'm putting something forward as an argument. The argument that your interlocutor here is presenting is about whether something is true or whether something is good. It's not about why they're putting it forward. On the flip side of this, you have arguing in bad faith, which is generally what we would call it when someone is putting forward an argument with ulterior motives. Right? They're not putting forward an argument in order to present what's true or in order to convince you, but they're putting forward an argument for some other reason, for usually some rhetorical reason or some psychological reason. This too can be uncharitable. Right? If you're putting forward an argument that is for the sake of getting some benefit from it, or for the sake of distracting your opponent from something. Right? These aren't taking your opponent's argument seriously, just the same way that any of these other uncharitable arguments aren't. This is because you're not directly addressing them. What you're doing is you're presenting something that is essentially irrelevant, right? You're making an argument, but not for the sake of arguing, not for the sake of demonstrating something. Another uncharitable argument or series or collection of uncharitable arguments would be misinterpretations, especially intentional misinterpretations of one's opponent. Generally, these can fall under the category of arguing in what's called a hermeneutic of discontinuity or of inconsistency. Hermeneutic is just a way of interpreting what someone has to say or interpreting a text, and discontinuity is usually in the scope of arguments or debates that are within a tradition, within an intellectual tradition. So what you're essentially saying, if you're taking this hermeneutic of discontinuity when interpreting one's opponent's arguments, is saying that you're interpreting them in such a way that they either contradict what they have previously said, right? So assuming that what they've said is in contradiction to something they've said previously, or interpreting them in such a way that they are in disagreement with some figure of authority in the field, whether that's an academic authority or otherwise. The best example of this we can point to is a lot of opponents of Pope Francis use this approach. So we can look to, sorry, my cat's doing something. Come back here. Come here. Angel. Felicia comes over. But a lot of opponents of Pope Francis will look to things that he puts forward, right? Statements that he says, whether official or unofficial, and they will assume that they're in conflict with either previous things that he has said, things that previous popes have said, or things that are established within the Catholic tradition. For example, we can look to the death penalty, where the Catechism was recently changed to reflect that the death penalty in current circumstances is inadmissible. Given the wording, we can interpret this in a few ways. We can interpret it in continuity with the tradition, saying that social circumstances have changed, and so the death penalty, the circumstances where the death penalty is acceptable, no longer apply, and so that we're keeping the same principles that previous popes and previous theologians have put forward, and just applying them to current circumstances. Or alternatively, and more uncharitably, we can say that this is a fundamental change in doctrine. By saying that it's inadmissible, what we're saying is that it's because we've changed our understanding of what's going on. Now, that is on its surface, right? Just given the wording, the new wording of the Catechism, which I'll include in the description below if you want to take a look at it. Given the wording, either of these is a plausible interpretation. However, to assume that it's in contradiction with what's been said before is to take this hermeneutic of discontinuity. It's to assume that what's being said now is in conflict with what's been said before. And at that point, we can say one of several things. We can either say that we were wrong before and right now and wrong before, or we can just use this as kind of evidence that there's a contradiction, right? That is, if there really is such a contradiction. So going back to the principle of charity, we should remember that we should always interpret what someone says in a way that makes the most sense. So, in this case, if Pope Francis says that the tradition is correct, and he also says that this is the case with respect to the death penalty, we should interpret those things in a way that they don't conflict with one another. Because otherwise we'd have to assume that he's saying something contradictory, which we shouldn't assume of someone that we're in a discussion with. So I'll conclude with a word of caution. I've gone through various uncharitable arguments. I've gone through various scenarios where we're not charitable towards our opponents, where we begin in a place of skepticism towards what they have to say. Now, these kinds of approaches are fallacious generally, at least on their surface. However, my word of caution is that sometimes your interlocutor does in fact say something incorrect, right? Sometimes your interlocutor does in fact contradict himself. Sometimes your interlocutor actually is presenting a bad argument, and sometimes they really are arguing in bad faith. So the principle of charity is an initial judgment. It is to say that we initially will should take them to mean something true if that's possible, right? If there's a possible interpretation where they make sense, believe that they make sense. However, they can disprove you on that point, right? Your interlocutor here can demonstrate by further argument that no, they really meant the contradictory thing, or they really meant the incorrect thing. And if that's the case, then you have to accept that. And then you can just argue against that point. And at that point, you're no longer being uncharitable because you're interpreting your interlocutor in the way that they want you to interpret their argument. But again, initially, we should assume that our interlocutor makes sense. Even if they're incorrect, we should assume that they're not spouting nonsense. So I hope these have been some useful tools for analyzing texts and analyzing arguments. And with that, I will see you next time.